Iran may have been months or years away from developing a nuclear bomb, so that there is no clear international legal precedent for the attacks. What is your position on that, and do you think it's damaging for Israel to be seen again after so many occasions to be breaching international law?
Well, what's the committee's position on an atomic bomb exploding in Israel in terms of the international
This would, of course, be a disaster.
Yes. So, yeah, you know, it's always a conflict whether or not to raise holocaustic arguments in discussions like this. We didn't speculate, we didn't feel, we saw the intelligence that tells us that Iran is rushing into the bomb, and the international law cannot do anything about it, or it doesn't have the willpower to do something about it, the international community. And we thought we cannot sit on our hands. Now, we are a law-abiding country, but the right for self-defense is part of the international law, especially opposite existential threats. So this is why we have operated the way we did. Let me remind you, if you're talking about the international law, there are only two countries, two member states in the United Nations, in which one is openly saying that its goal is the total destruction of the other. The Iranians have said it again and again on public platforms. We are the
Israeli ministers who have said similar things about the population in Gaza and Tehran. I mean, if we're just picking out individual statements.
Okay, hang on. And let's not go into that rabbit hole at this moment. Can I perhaps approach it from another way? Let me see if I can put it this way. So we've heard your evidence that that Israel was under threat, and certainly the bellicose language used by Iran was something that we put to the ambassador. The fact that they had nuclear material that seemed to be much purer than 3.6% without any kind of explanation for it also is very threatening to Israel. We appreciate all of that, but the evidence that the threat was an imminent one is something which is, I think, an important point. And although it's something that the Israelis have said, and sometimes the Americans have said, some Americans have said, and some Americans have said many things, within a few days. What we haven't had is we haven't had any evidence. And I wondered why, if the Israelis believed that they were under imminent threat, why it was that they didn't produce that evidence before the international community. Don't you regret not putting that evidence before us all so that we can understand why it was an imminent threat as opposed to a threat that may happen within a few months or a few years? And as my colleague has said, if it's a question of the threat a few months or years ahead, we will get back to that position again unless we have negotiations.
It's a fair question. If you are, while you're presenting to the world the factual imminent threat, usually it's too late. But on top of this, and of course, you're always limited by the fact that you don't want to surrender your intelligence sources. Now, the entire international community is a bit post-traumatic from the United States going to war against Iraq based on information that is flawed. This is not the case.
How do we know that?
What?
So sorry. How do we know that you're not going to war on the basis of flawed evidence? We haven't seen anything at all, flawed or not.
You saw you saw Fordow, you saw Natanz, you saw Isfahan, we've shown the Americans, of course, large with the cooperation or sharing of information was quite extensive. And I'm going back to the beginning of our conversation. I am no fan of Israel's government, and I'm going to have, I don't know, easy time discussing with you about Gaza, but easier time than the government, because I completely disagree with what they're doing there.
We will get on to that.
On this one, at one point or another, you will have to decide who you trust. So I'm telling you, if you want to know who you trust, Israel or Iran, on this, you should trust Israel.
Let me see if I can approach it this way. Because we talk about trust, and obviously I think we seem to all be agreeing that in order for there to be a long-lasting peace in the Middle East, we need to have a negotiated settlement. It needs to be negotiated, there needs to be a clear agreement with the Iranians, what they can do and what they can't do, and it needs to make sure that it's enforced and enforced clearly. And exactly what comes out of the negotiations is obviously subject to negotiation. But in order for there to be trust, in order for there to be a proper negotiation, there needs to be trust on both sides. And the Iranian ambassador, and I think I should put this to you, essentially said, we agreed to JCPOA, and the Americans walked away from it, egged on by the Israelis, he believes. And then we are in a second lot of negotiations, and in the middle of those negotiations, the Israelis start bombing us when we're going into those negotiations in good faith. And then, I mean, he wasn't here to say this, but I imagine he would now say, and then the Americans say nothing's going to happen for 2 weeks, and within a few days, the Americans are bombing us. So in those circumstances, one could understand that there would be quite a lot of work needing to be done to get the Iranians to be able to trust the Americans and the Israelis if there are to be negotiations. Do you accept that?
I have a problem with the premise, if I may. The Iranians are lying, and the Iranians are doing this using a language and a vocabulary that the Western world is fond of. They are talking about international law while oppressing the young and the women and the LGBT community. They're talking about democracy when they're not a democracy. They're talking about the two sides of this equation, while there are no two sides of an equation. This is a regime we have no problem with that says they want to kill all the Jews because they're Jews, because this is the deep, radical version, twisted version of Islam. I don't think this is Islam. I mean, Islam is something different, but they have twisted Islam into this radical version. But they know that when they're talking into the oldest parliament in the world, they need to say things about their rights and our duty to recognize their side of the story.
Okay.
I don't accept this premise.
Okay. May I take you back to Edward? And then I think Uma's here, so Uma may have some questions for you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Lapid. I'm interested in just following on a little bit from the Chair's point and going back to the 5 things that you outlined in terms of what Israel is looking for Iran to agree to. And I'm sort of struck by the fact that having just been bombed by 2 nuclear powers, giving up your nuclear ambitions, wouldn't seem to incentivize